This is a paper. What I'm going to do first actually is give you some background to it. It's a paper, as you can see, that I've co-authored with David Russell. And David Russell is the CEO of the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission, and the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission is a statutory body established under the terms of the Belfast Agreement. It's an A-rated, UN A-rated human rights commission, so it's a very, very important commission, and it does a lot of very, very good work. So, and I should say, Dave Russell, a very good friend of mine, is a very, very astute, very, very smart guy. But as far as this paper goes, the problem is that he's the kind of lawyer, for a better term, on this paper. So anything that you might want to direct it, well, I'm not sure I can answer those questions, but maybe Ron can answer them. We've got a lawyer in our midst, so we'll pass them over to Ron if I can't answer Dave's bits of the paper. So it may be helpful just to give you some background as to where this paper came from. So as you know, there was a power sharing arrangement established in Northern Ireland in 1998, 1999. It's a power sharing arrangement between British Unionists and Irish nationalists, effectively, although there is another category called others. I don't know how to feel about being called another, but there are some people under the scheme that are known as others. Anyway, it was established in 1998, but since then it's had a very, very rocky time. It keeps getting suspended. It keeps breaking down for various reasons. It's currently suspended again since 2022, and there's no sign of it getting back up and running. So basically, Northern Ireland has no government. It's been run either from, well, I guess the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. So it's run from Whitehall, effectively, with the Northern Irish Civil Service as well. But it has no democratically elected government, because it's been suspended again. Now, it was suspended also from 2017 to 2020. For 3 years, it had no government. And there were a range of issues that led to this particular suspension to do with, well, one had to do with corruption, effectively, but in more kind of broader, kind of more philosophical terms, it had to do with legacy issues, how they would deal with the past in Northern Ireland. It had to do with the Irish language, where this we recognised as an official language in Northern Ireland, which it has now been recognised as. It strikes me as a bit pointless because no one can speak it, really, or no one can speak it better than they can speak English, but I know that's a different issue, I suppose. But another reason why it was suspended was because of the misuse of the veto system. A very prominent part of power sharing arrangements, especially the consociation form of power sharing, is mutual vetoes, or minority vetoes, as they're sometimes called. It's effectively so that, that the minority can't be outvoted. So they put in place vetoes, they're built into the system. The problem is vetoes are meant to encourage cooperation, stability, compromise, all those sorts of things. But the problem is it can also lead to deadlock, and that's what's happening in Northern Ireland. So if you look at the figures for the use of the veto, it's gone like this. When they started in 1999, they used it maybe in the first couple of years before the first suspension 8 or 9 times. By the time we got to 2017, they were using it about 50 times a year. I mean, really, it's extraordinary to see they vetoed absolutely everything. So we're seeing not just overuse, actually, but misuse, and I'll talk about the difference between the two, actually, maybe later on. So all of these power sharing deals, like in Belgium, like in Bosnia, like in Burundi, they all have these kind of veto mechanisms built into them, and they're known by different names. One of the veto mechanisms in Northern Ireland is known as the petition of concern, which is the bit of the veto that we were concerned with. Effectively, what it means, if you don't like a decision that's going through the assembly, if you can get the 30 signatures, you can try and get it stopped. It would have to be a cross-community vote in the Parliament. For that to stop it, you have to have a majority overall and a majority within each community. So you have to have a majority. A majority within one of the communities. So it's effectively so that unionists can veto nationalists and nationalists can veto unionists. So they can just, as I say, submit a petition to the Speaker of the House. And they have to hold a cross-community vote at that point. So the problem was they were submitting petitions left, right, and centre, and it ground the entire system to a halt. So, as I say, the great hope is that vetoes can actually encourage cooperation, because if you don't try and cooperate, the other side will simply veto you. So if you want to get anything done, you have to compromise. So that looks like a good thing. But the problem is that the risk that attaches to vetoes is around the issue of deadlock. And that's what we're seeing in Northern Ireland. However, what you don't hear so much about is that there are also concerns here about the question of political equality. As I said a while ago, in Northern Ireland, when you get elected to the Parliament, you have to designate as a nationalist, a unionist, or another. But when it comes to vetoes, others can't veto. So they don't have the same standing within the system because they can't veto decisions. They're not part of the veto system as such. And that looks like a failure of political equality. And I think it has important implications for actually the future of democracy in Northern Ireland and the capacity or space for moving towards something that would be more progressive, something that would look more like the kind of democracy you would want there to be. Anyway, so what happened was it broke down, and what the government did, this is all, I haven't got to the paper yet, by the way, it's just all kind of give you some background to it. What the government, the British and Irish governments did was that they created a set of working groups to look at these different issues, legacy issues, the Irish language issue, but also the petition of concern issue about how reforms could be made to the 1998, effectively, the Belfast Agreement is effectively a constitution, how the constitution could be amended so that these kind of problems could be dealt with or handled a bit more productively. And I'm not entirely sure whether the Human Rights Commission approached the working group or whether the working group approached the commission. I think it was the latter, actually. But then the Human Rights Commission contacted me to help them with this, to see what we could do. Is there some way in which we could actually improve the ways in which vetoes worked so that they'd be less prone to deadlock? And so that's where that is really kind of the origins of this paper. And we submitted advice to the working group. Well, the Human Rights Commission submitted it, but I was part of the team that actually wrote this advice. So what did we say? Well, interestingly, so the proposal that we wrote said, well, the first paragraph here, we suggested that valid petitions. So again, if you want to veto something, you have to set a petition to the Speaker of the House. If there are enough signatories, then there has to be a cross-community vote. If cross-community vote fails, the decision or bill or whatever it is vetoed at that point. So our suggestion was that valid petitions should first be required to pass a justificatory test grounded in existing human rights law. So you had to justify the use of it. The test should require political parties, and again, this is a quotation from the submission we made, not just to explain why a given decision should be subject to a cross-community vote, but to do so by reference to a set of universal human rights standards. So this was the proposal. What happened was then in 2020, they effectively amended the Constitution via a document known as the New Decade, New Approach document. And interestingly, it said that a petition, again, this is what you submit to the Speaker of the House, it must be accompanied by a statement of the grounds and rationale upon which it is being tabled. Moreover, a valid petition of concern shall trigger a 14 period of consideration, including on any reports on whether, measure, or proposal for legislation is in conformity with equality requirements, including the European Convention on Human Rights and the Bill of Rights, equality legislation, and so on. I mean, we don't know what happened. They were closed door sessions. We don't know what these discussions, these working groups, what exactly they talked about. But I mean, I would say this, but there seems to be a fairly close fit between what we proposed and what actually made it into this constitutional amendment. So we like to think we made some kind of a difference, that we injected, in our terms, some deliberative democracy actually into how petitions work within these institutions. So that's the background to it. What we've tried to do since then is actually write a paper that would actually spell out in theoretical terms the thinking behind this proposal that would be more general, that would address the question of how vetoes are used from a broader, more normative or philosophical perspective, to set out what those arguments would be, and also to consider some of the general concerns that might attach to it. So that really was where the paper comes from. So we did this bit first, and then we wrote the paper afterwards. And that's how that came about, if that makes sense. So yeah, back to theory. So this is just a kind of an introductory slide laying out what the paper is about. So vetoes are a prominent feature in power sharing democracies, especially in what's known as the consociation model of power sharing. The consociation is the dominant form of power sharing around the world. As I say, they have it in Belgium, they have it in Lebanon, they have it in Burundi, they have it in Northern Ireland, and so on. In fact, actually, if the international community is going to try and encourage power sharing in a divided society, it's almost always consociation that they favour. Consociation has four features. It's a power sharing government or executive, it's proportionality in the electoral system, but also in the allocation of ministerial portfolios. It also has a high degree of what they call segmental autonomy, which is on matters of exclusive concern to groups. They're allowed to get on with it themselves, effectively. They don't have to take decisions on this. But also the fourth feature of a consociation system of power sharing is the idea of a mutual veto. Now, as Leiphart laid this out, at least, the whole idea was that these mutual vetoes would be there to protect the communities or groups, ethnic groups, whatever you want to call them, their vital interests. So this phrase pops up all the time, vital. It's about protecting groups' vital ethnic interests. It's not at all clear what makes an interest vital or fact, it's not even clear what an interest is in these contexts. But the term is always bandied around, and I have a plan to do some work around that. What exactly is a vital interest? But for our purposes, it's enough to say that it has to do with the group's identity, but it also has to do with the kind of normal things that the member of a group would want. Say, for example, access to education, housing, jobs, and so on. These are, of course, vital to the prospects of the members of these kinds of groups, and they would want to have those protected. So that's what they're for protecting vital interests. And as I said a while ago, the intention is to actually foster compromise and stability. If you want to get something done, you have to take account of what the other side might think, because otherwise they may veto it. And so the idea is that a driver of compromise. The difficulty is, of course, that it may be used to pursue narrower party interests or broader ideological goals. So, for example, one of the problems in Northern Ireland is that one of the Unionist Party, the more extreme right-wing Democratic Unionist Party, the DUP, has used it on many occasions to actually stymie developments around abortion law and same-sex marriage and so on. This has nothing to do with ethnic interests. In fact, they're clear about it. They claim that people will vote for them. People from the national side will vote for them precisely because they agree on these issues of abortion, same-sex marriage, and so on. So it has nothing to do with communal interests per se, but they use the veto to that end. So that looks like a misuse to me, depending, of course, on how you define vital interest, which has never been defined. But it looks like it's been misused. So what can you do about that? Well, there are basically two solutions. One is to get the groups in advance, say, for example, when they're writing a constitution, to set down in advance what they think their vital interests are. So you can't suddenly start introducing new ones. That's very problematic, of course, because these things change, or interests change, groups' interests change over time. And it's also a real risk that some of these interests will fall through the cracks. Groups are not monoliths, they change. So I don't think that's a very good way of doing it. It would solve the problem of overuse or misuse, because if it wasn't listed in advance, you can't do it, but it introduces a whole range of other problems. The alternative is to not go for a restrictive approach where people, as I say, predetermine what their interests are, but to go for a more kind of permissive approach where people can define and redefine them as they go along. The problem with that, of course, is that opens up scope for misuse and overuse and misuse. So what can you do about it? And the argument in the paper, which I'll come to now, is actually that what we need to do is, you can define them as you go along, but there has to be some conditions on this. And the condition in this case has to be some sort of justificatory test. You have to be able to justify your use of it. And the question is, what would that justificatory test look like? What should it look like? What would it involve? What were the obligations attaching to it? And that's really what the paper seeks to set out. I've given it away here, you can see it, but never mind. So, why vetoes? Interestingly, while I said a while ago in power sharing systems, proportionality is enormous. You have proportionality in the electoral system, you have proportionality in the allocation of ministerial portfolios, you may have a proportionality in the allocation of jobs in the army, the courts, and so on. So everything is about proportionality. The difficulty with that, of course, is that decisions still need to be made, and decisions always inevitably have to be made by means of majority rule. One community will be bigger than the other. So the problem of majority tyranny is always going to be there. And at the root of any of these conflicts, it is precisely that, majority tyranny, because even if you have a power sharing government, if ministerial portfolios are allocated proportionally, you still have to have a vote, you have to make a decision. It still has to be, by majority rule, and that's a problem. To understand really at the base of that really is it's kind of the defining feature, I think, of a divided society is the phenomenon of ethnic parties and ethnic voting. Basically, in divided societies, people vote for their own parties. They don't vote for the other side. There is no real cross-voting. There are no floating voters. People vote for their own side. The parties are seek to represent their own side. And so what you get actually at election time, you get two different competitions. You get a competition within this case, within the unionist community, and you get a competition within the nationalist community. And very often extremism wins out, actually. They play the ethnic card. The hardcore parties actually win the day, because what they do is they play on people's fears and worries about the future. They say, oh yeah, these moderates in the middle, yeah, they're going to compromise, but they're going to sell out. They're going to sell out our most vital interests, our concerns for the future. They're going to compromise away. They're going to moderate away the things we have fought for so long. So extremism pays in these contexts in terms of elections. The problem is, the extremists get voted into power, but then they have to move together with these power-sharing coalitions, and that's extremely difficult. Especially then when we have the kind of misuse of vetoes that we're talking about here. And it leads to deadlock and instability. This is the theory, and it's precisely what we've seen play out in Northern Ireland. We've also seen it in other places, and where they've had tremendous problems actually forming governments, in Belgium, for example, and Iraq, for example, and Bosnia. All these different countries where they have these power sharing regimes have terrible difficulties actually creating governments because of the veto system attaching to them. Another problem, of course, which I think, in kind of more kind of normative or philosophical terms, is the treatment of those who are not communally aligned, the people who don't think about themselves or their political interests or their lives in ethnic terms. They may be from a particular ethnic community, but it's not something they actually necessarily want to privilege, or they want to pursue through the political system. Anyway, the two together, I think, and this is where the paper ends up in the end, the net effect of the combination of these two things, the focus on these extremist hardcore parties that are prone to deadlocking one another, and the fact that we pay too little cognizance to the interests of people who do not want to think of themselves along these lines, is that it's very, very hard to move beyond division or to move towards a greater focus on the good of society as a whole. That's where you end up with this. Now, as I said a while ago, the great hope here is that, look, you have to have vetoes. There's nothing you can do about that. We're not suggesting for a second that you can do away with vetoes, because because people vote along, as we were saying a while ago, ethnic voting, ethnic parties. People vote along ethnic lines. That's inevitable in societies, at least for the short to mid-term. So you simply have to have vetoes, because otherwise you'll have one community outvoting the other, and that can cause a spiral back into conflict. So you have to have the vetoes. The thing is, if you're going to have them, though, they have to be justified, and they have to be justified, we think, in terms that are actually acceptable to everybody. And this is really the kind of deliberative democracy bit, which is why they were interested in having me on board in this. And this is just a very, very, standard principle. If you're going to be bound by a decision, this is something we find right throughout the deliberative literature, but not just that. This principle of reciprocity we find right across the Anglo-American political philosophy, at least. If you're going to be bound by a decision, some people say affected, we can talk about that if you want, then the reasons on which that decision rests should be both accessible and acceptable to you. So the idea is, in a democracy, people can't simply make decisions over your head. The reasons behind them must, in some sense, you might agree with them, but at least you can accept them and see that there's some merit in them. It's just a cornerstone of democracy. If you're going to be bound by a decision, well, then you should have a say in the making of that decision. It's just a definition of democracy, if you like. Sometimes people refer to as the all-affected or the all-affected interest principle, but I prefer bound. That doesn't trip off the tongue so easily, because people are affected in all sorts of ways, but they're not necessarily bound by the decision. But anyway, so that's a very, very general principle. It's a very, very universal principle. I mean, it goes right back to Roman law and probably further beyond that. But really, I think in kind of our modern period, at least, it's about the idea that people should appeal to widely shared public values. Of course, Rawls is probably the most famous exponent of this view in a contemporary period, in this theory of public reason. Well, why? Well, the philosophical argument is simply that, by appealing to reasons that you think others could accept, you're at least recognizing them as political equals. And you're saying, you are the kind of person that actually deserves that. I respect you. I respect your standing as a political equal. And as part of that, I recognize you as a co-equal, and the obligation on me to try and provide a justification that you could at least in some level find accessible and acceptable. It's just a recognition of our standing as political equals, I think, is what it really boils down to. The difficulty, of course, is that these public reasons, things like equality, inclusion, toleration, respect, these values that you hear about a lot, they are semantically indeterminate. They are open to interpretive dispute. It's not clear what they are. And in fact, in divided societies, what you mean by equality and what I mean by equality could itself be a source of tremendous conflict. It actually deepen problems. So this business of semantic indeterminacy, it's real across the board. In divided societies, it can take on a really kind of virulent and conflict-inducing character. So, it's not a panacea, this kind of public reason approach, but I think it has some mileage. I think it's also the case that semantic indeterminacy will probably be constrained by at least two factors. And first, of course, is institutional rules and procedures. There are certain standing orders, but also prior decisions, precedent, and so on. There's a lot that's going on here that constrain the scope for interpretation. So I think that helps. And one of the things that's going on here as well is that, especially within these power sharing systems, which, say, for example, in Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom, and the United Kingdom is itself party to a whole load of international human rights treaties. So there's already a whole load of stuff here that delimit how we can interpret these norms, just by virtue of the fact that, as I say, Northern Ireland is part of the UK, and the UK is part of this broad international treaty system, including things like the European Convention on Human Rights and a wide range of other human rights instruments. So the idea here is that, look, this idea of public reason or public values approach is a bit indeterminate. It's true, but there are certain things that constrain the scope for interpretive dispute, including existing rules and procedures and precedents and so on, but also the kinds of commitments that the UK government has already entered into via various kinds of international treaties and so on. So effectively, that's the idea of the paper. If you are going to try and veto a decision, if you are going to use this petition of concern, for example, in Northern Ireland, Belgium, the alarm bell procedure, and have these kind of funny names for these vetoes, well, then, you must be able to show that somehow that the decision or bill or motion is incompatible with human rights law. That's a requirement. If you remember the very first slide I put up, that's what they've written. I'll just bring it back up so you can see it very quickly. You can see a petition, which is a veto effectively, must be accompanied by a statement of the grounds and rationale upon which it has been tabled. A valid petition should trigger a 14-day period of consultation, including on any reports on whether a measure or proposal for legislation, a bill or motion, whatever it is in conformity with equality requirements, including the European Convention of Human Rights. So they've said it, which is what we wanted them to say. We want them to do it in terms of public reason, elaborated via things like existing human rights obligations. And that was the proposal that we made. We think that is a good way of thinking through what laws meant. And we've kind of got it built into the current constitutional structures for Northern Ireland, which is, so right, it's not a bad thing to do. So that is it. And if they can't do it, well, then it can't be. If they can't show that it's incompatible with human rights law, then they can't veto it. So the idea is to, well, in one sense, it's to stop just misuse and overuse of the veto. Like it's not this, as I said, we recognize there must be vetoes, but we think that they should be carefully constrained in ways that I think, broadly accepted. So now I've forgotten to look at it. Perfect. So really just kind of two objections, two concerns about all of this. The first one is obviously who gets to decide? Who would decide whether something is compatible with human rights law or not? And who would do this? Well, I guess one obvious possibility is the courts might decide this. You could take it, maybe the courts could be charged with deciding whether this thing is compatible with human rights law or not. They would seem to be very well placed to do this. The difficulty with this, of course, is, this is a very wide topic, Ron, and this is much discussed, whether the court should play these kinds of roles. But the worry is that it would make society very litigious, would make it very, very, people, it's not quite American, people suing each other left, right, and centre, but it would make it a bit more like that. But I think more to the point in a deeply divided society, and this goes back to the problem of ethnic parties and ethnic voting that I mentioned earlier on, it may lead politicians to grandstand, play the ethnic card, because they might as well play it. It's good for them in voting terms, and they don't have to take responsibility for taking decisions. The courts will have to pick up the mess. You might as well take an extreme position on this because you can terrify your voters and shore up your own support. But the problem is it makes politics very, very difficult. There's an awful lot of pressure on the courts to do this. So I think that's bad news. Well, unsurprisingly, given that this paper was co-authored with the CEO of the Human Rights Commission, we think that maybe another body that could make this kind of determination would be something like human rights commissions or equality commissions, which you often find in these kinds of societies. So they are a prominent feature of divided societies already. And more to the point, actually, the United Nations recognizes their ability to exercise quasi-judicial authority. So they're already viewed as not having kind of authority, the same authority, of course, but having at least some standing to make these kinds of claims. And insofar as they are impartial, insofar as they are, above the fray in some sense, well, at least they have the standing to make these kinds of judgments. Now, this is, political scientists like to talk a lot about perceived legitimacy. They have to be perceived as legitimate and all this. And, whether they are above the fray or not is a different question entirely. But, the bottom line is somebody has to make this determination, but the politicians themselves can't make it. They're the last people who want to make these decisions, simply because, well, They're the ones causing the problem in the first place. So it looks like equality human rights commissions might be good candidates for making decisions of the sort. You might be able to think of some others. I wouldn't be surprised at all if you did, but we'll see. So that's one issue, that issue of who decides. Another one is about, whether human rights law. Ron, this might kind of get you excited. I'm not sure. I mean,
I am excited.
You are good. I'm very pleased to hear it. Okay. Well, it's whether they're determinate enough actually to provide answers to these kinds of cases. So Alex Swartz, and you know Alex, don't you, Ron? Do you know? You don't. Well, he was at Hong Kong, I don't know where he's gone now, but but anyway, so he's critical of this proposal on two grounds, or well, a number of grounds really, but effectively he thinks that in a way that I don't quite understand. I'm hoping somebody can explain it to me. He says, this is pretty much a quote from what he says: if these human rights instruments or commitments are interpreted narrowly, for example, to mean that only decisions that are suspect from the perspective of the European Convention on Human Rights can be blocked, then it may be that very few vetoes would succeed. I don't know why he thinks that. It may be because there may be other grounds for wanting to actually veto decisions beyond compatibility with the European Convention. I don't know what the issue here is, but he certainly thinks that it may be too narrow. And if it is too narrow, the problem is vetoes won't do what they're meant to do, which is block decisions that negatively affect the vital interests of particular communities. That's bad. On the other hand, Swartz thinks that if they're interpreted too broadly, for example, if you take in Northern Ireland, for example, Section 75, equality of opportunity measures, well, any decision could do better on a broad criterion of that sort. So basically, you could block anything. So if the first one is the problem that it doesn't give enough guarantees, the problem with the second, if it's too broad, the difficulty is any decision can be vetoed and get you back to square one. You're in trouble again because they just veto everything. Well, here's where I run into trouble because I don't know enough about this stuff, but I'm told at least that actually human rights instruments are far more nuanced than this. It's not an either or between a narrow or a very permissive approach. There's a lot more the jurisprudence around this is a lot more subtle. There's a lot more going on here, that there's a lot more room for kind of thinking through this. It's not a very narrow reading or a very expansive reading. There's much more apparently going on here. That said, it's true that human rights will be silent on some issues. So, for example, in the paper, we give the example, say, for example, the government in Northern Ireland wants to shift decisions about housing from the Assembly, from the local parliament to local councils. And somebody wants to question that. You can see why they would want to question it, because housing was, of course, a huge source of discrimination in the bad old days in Northern Ireland, and they would be worried about that. They could say, well, giving this to local councils really does raise issues of vital interest here that we need to be concerned about. So you would look at what the law says on this, and it turns out, or so I'm led to believe, that the law is silent on this issue. So you couldn't veto it because the law doesn't give an answer actually on this issue. So yeah, you go ahead, you enact your decision, and local councils get to decide. Now, it could well be that people's fears about the fears that vital interests would be engaged here and trampled in some sense, that turns out to be true. Local councils will be dominated by one community rather than another, and perhaps they will be very biased in actually how they allocate housing. Now, I guess there's a couple of things you can say in response to that. I mean, human rights law doesn't stop human rights abuses from happening. They happen anyway. But at this point, I think this is where the courts do have a role. This is where they would step in, I think, at this point. I don't know if that's a very satisfactory answer, but I guess the thing is, this is not going to be a panacea, but it surely has got to be better than where we otherwise might be. So to wrap up, I think it's clear that there is a need for justificatory clause. You just can't veto because you feel like vetoing. That's no good, because that's going to get you deadlock. It's going to get you the kind of situation that we have in Northern Ireland. I think crucially, whatever the justificatory test is, however you think of it or however you think it should be grounded, it should aim to ensure that all interests, and I really should have underlined the word all here, because it's not just communal interests or ethnic interests we're concerned about. We're concerned about the ethnically non-aligned. We're concerned about the interests of individuals in society as well. They also should be given due consideration in all of this. I understand there must be vetoes, and I understand that it must be communities that have them, but the justification should be broader than that. It should be more inclusive. It should include people who don't think of their interests in those terms. We've suggested the public reason is one possible approach, but the difficulty is very abstract. It's a bit too high level, really, for what we want here. And so we've suggested human rights law looks like a plausible candidate. And really what's important about this whole idea of a justificatory clause, is not just that we think that it may give or lend greater stability to a political system, but it may also point the way to a more progressive politics, because eventually the fact is with these societies, they have to divide less and share more. They have to stop thinking about everything through ethnic lens. I mean, they'll fight over anything. I mean, it might be a road sign, is that a Catholic road sign or a Protestant road? It's incredible. A huge dispute over locations of things like pregnancy or maternity wards, whether they be in a kind of a nationalist part of a city or in a unionist part. It's extraordinary. Any issue can become an ethnic issue effectively. We need to get beyond that. And one of the ways we should do it, I think, is thinking about concerns in more societal terms, in broader terms. And you can do that, I think, by thinking in terms of public reason, the kind of deliberative democracy that we're all interested in this room. This is where we need to be going with this, because it points importantly to life beyond ethnic politics. It points to somewhat of a more progressive form of politics that I think public reason and more broadly still deliberative democracy can deliver. So that's it.